Hello, and thanks for joining us across Queensland for the 7 News documentary.
For the past 37 years, Brisbane's talked about the flood of 1974. From here on, the talk will be about the flood of 2011. Deadlier,
Costlier, and forever destroying the myth that Brisbane was flood-proof.
Midnight, the start of a new year. Spirits were high in Brisbane. So were floodwaters across a vast area of Queensland. In Emerald, 1,000 homes were underwater.
This is an urgent message.
Theodore had been emptied. The first time in Queensland history an entire town was evacuated by helicopter. Condamine was the second. Chinchilla had already flooded. So too Dalby. And Warwick.
Righto, people, move out of the way for the bus. Get out of the way.
And Bundaberg. Residents in the city of Rockhampton were hit. Maryborough was next. Then the town of St George. And the main street of Gympie. And Oakey. Chaos statewide. 97 communities flooded or isolated. Some towns repeatedly.
This is the fourth one we've had in a matter of 3 weeks. We had a big one, a medium one, then a big one, and then another one's coming again.
We had to pack up, put everything up on higher ground.
And then the deluge began across the southeast. And a brown, murky mass started moving. The dams quickly filled up, but Wivenhoe could take it. At least that's what many assumed.
It was a triple whammy of extreme weather events that combined to create the flood of 2011. Problem number one was the huge volume of water flowing into Wivenhoe Dam. Now, because its flood storage compartment filled rapidly, that water was released and began making its way to the city. Problem number two, the deadly torrent coming down Lockyer Creek. The highest on record, and it travelled faster than previously seen, towards the Brisbane River, where it enters just below Wivenhoe Dam. And on top of that, problem number three, another 300 millimetres of rain falling right across the region. Making matters worse, factor in the extra water flowing down the Bremer River and flooding Ipswich. And that's why Brisbane's flood was much deeper and happened more suddenly than anybody thought possible.
Brisbane, the river city, again a city in the river. Australia's third largest city inundated.
Well, I think this is probably the first time in Australia's history where we've ever had one of our largest cities actually be paralysed completely for nearly a week.
77 Brisbane suburbs were impacted by floodwater. 32,000 homes and businesses affected at the peak. The nightmare of 1974 had returned. Homes vanished underwater.
Devastating for the people affected, hugely costly. This is probably our most damaging flood since, or flood period, since European settlement.
Some things were different. In 1974, the boaties of Brisbane helped save the people of Brisbane. The SES was just being formed from the old Civil Defence Organisation. Back then, there were 3 flash flood events along Brisbane's creeks. Thankfully, in 2011, that didn't happen. The 1974 flood hit on a long weekend with many more people away. The warnings to residents back then meant nothing to people in the suburbs. This time, council used technology to get information out. In 1974, the Weather Bureau relied on people to phone in creek heights. Now, those readings are automated. But what has changed dramatically, the amount of development on the floodplain. Take Rosalie as an example. In 1974, there was a butcher shop and strip of businesses. Now, the butcher shop is a deli, surrounded by an entire dining precinct. Across Ipswich and Brisbane, more businesses and homes in the flood zone.
It's been enormous. It's just unbelievable, the amount of development. With houses still being built, obviously, in flood-prone areas. The stuff that had to be pulled out of the houses and dumped was identical to 1974. Tragic.
For a quarter of a century after Wivenhoe was constructed, Brisbane slept soundly. Residents lulled into a false sense of security. It reduced the flood risk, but never eliminated it. The flood of 2011 was a shock. Misery compounded by looters, wretched acts against people who'd lost everything.
If they are caught, they'll be used as flood markers.
The central business district went under. People were mesmerised by the boats being dashed against bridges. 500 private pontoons headed for Moreton Bay. Riverwalk set sail on its own, threatening the gateway bridges. The Drift Cafe lived up to its name. Bizarre sights as normality was swept downstream. Fast food restaurants were consumed by slow-moving water. Ipswich streetlights became water depth markers. In Brisbane, power lines did the same thing. The Cauldron, more suitable for swim meets than Origin grudge matches. And King Wally, wearing a snorkel and floaties. Water covered the centre court of Pat Rafter Arena. Beach surf lifesavers were deployed into suburbs. Cows took refuge on top of houses, horses resting on rooftops. A paddling pool used to stay dry. Strange sights as the flood of 2011 took hold. And when all the water vanished, streets of ruin and mountains of mud. It was more than people could bear alone. Thankfully, they didn't have to. A flood of volunteers lifted spirits.
It's just amazing. My family was so worried about me because they don't live in Brisbane, and when I told them about how people were going to help me, they broke down too. They just can't believe it.
Over the next hour, we'll examine each phase of the flood of 2011.
Starting in Toowoomba and the Lockyer Valley, where residents received no warning at all as a wall of water crashed through towns and communities.
And rescuers saved so many lives. Their remarkable stories next.